Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson describes drought conditions to the north. Frank Bai shows how UNL researchers are using a suspended camera to measure plant characteristics. Tamra Jackson-Ziems gives an update on corn diseases, and Keith Glewen talks about soybean production in west central Nebraska. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our market analyst this week. Through the first 6 months of the year, foreign demand for U.S. corn, soybeans, and wheat was stronger than a year ago. The value of exports for corn was 19% higher, soybeans were up 27%, and wheat increased 38%. Japan was the top buyer of U.S. corn and the second leading importer of wheat. China, unsurprisingly, accounted for the majority of U.S. beans, and Mexico led the way in wheat. In North Dakota, producers are waiting out a months-long drought. Last week's U.S. Drought Monitor indicated less than 1% of the state had normal moisture conditions. Frayne joined us Tuesday afternoon, and we began by asking how drought has impacted production.
Yeah, so we've got quite a bit of variation in conditions. Visually, if you were to take kind of the state of North Dakota and divide it diagonally, the southwest corner of the state, portion of the state, has had the most severe drought conditions, are the areas that have had most adverse impact on the drought and yield potential. But as you get into the northeast corner of the state, yields are actually going to be, I think, pretty normal. They had a little more rain last fall. They've had a few more rain showers this spring, so that portion of the state's in much better condition. So again, traveling across the state, you've got to be very careful about where you're talking and crop conditions as we move forward.
Well, and about which crop you're talking to, right?
That's correct. We've recently had some rains that have come through the state. In particular along the southern border, along the South Dakota-North Dakota border. And again, that's given some reprieve to some of the drought conditions for those later season crops like corn and soybeans and sunflowers. It really did give us a chance to kind of catch up. Our wet daytime temperatures have been a bit cooler, so that again is helping. It wasn't enough rain to be able to recharge and really give us some soil moisture, but it was enough to give some reprieve and I think boost some optimism that the yields may not be quite as bad as we were expecting, especially again on the later season crops.
Spring wheat, though, has been pretty bad, I assume?
Yeah, the spring wheat area, again, as you divide the state, the southwest corner, well, the whole state of North Dakota in particular, but the southwest does produce quite a bit of spring wheat. The northwest corner is really our Durham area, and of course the dry weather extends into some of the wheat growing regions in Montana. So of the spring wheat growing region, a large portion of that right now is under drought or some kind of drought conditions, a little over 50% based on USDA calculations. And again, a lot of that crop has now been harvested or has been baled up for hay as a roughage source for the livestock producers. But again, that northeast corner, as we get closer to the Canadian border and move east into Minnesota, some of those fields look awful good. So I've had some questions about yield potential or yield numbers, especially coming out of both USDA and some of the private reports. And I'll be honest, I think the yield numbers are reasonably close, just because we do have a lot of wheat that's grown in those areas that have some better yield potential.
Well, weather played such a big role in that commodity run-up in July, but since then, can you describe what's happened to those markets?
Yeah, especially for wheat and other markets as well, we tend to have kind of this pendulum swinging sometimes a little too far high on the high side or a little too far on the low side. I think during the development of the drought in North Dakota and Montana, the spring wheat market over-responded to that. We've seen some retracement in prices, in particular spring wheat prices. But kind of the kickoff to that and the lower prices we're seeing right now really was the USDA reports, in particular the production estimates for the production estimates for corn and for soybeans. They were lower than the trend line yields, but obviously higher than what the market was expecting. And so that's really put a lot of negative news or negative bias back into the marketplace. And so now I think we've seen those futures market prices retrace quite heavily. Again, moving forward, we'll have to see if those price or yield forecasts hold.
Do you think those prices have gone too far to the downside?
I do. Personally, I do. And I know I'm reading some other analysts and other opinions about what's happening in the marketplace. Right now, we're looking at an oversold position. So if you look at some of the technical indicators we have in the marketplace, it looks like we've sold more contracts than probably necessary. And again, there's this momentum downward. I think we're going to start to see some of that rebound. As we move through the rest of the week, we're going to be starting hearing about some of the private analysts and what their yield expectations and yield reports are. There'll be some more coming out next week. My expectation is that some of the private analysts will come in with slightly lower numbers than what the USDA has been projecting. And just on a sidebar, I do think that as we get into the September and October reports, I think those USDA estimates will also start to move downward or be downward trending, just based on the methodology that they use to come up with those numbers.
What do you think farmers should be focusing on now as they either try to unload old crop or sell some new crop?
Yeah, and I've been getting a lot of questions, especially for old crop corn. There was a few people that I know kind of hanging on, hoping that we'd see a little bit of improvement in basis, or after the August 10th report out of USDA, see some improvement in prices. That would be kind of their incentive to be able to clean out the bins and get some of the old crop moved through the system. And of course, now with the much lower prices, that's become a much more greater challenge. I guess my suggestion, my recommendation is I think we're on the downside. We'll see a little bit of a rebound, a bounce, probably close to those levels that we saw earlier this summer. I don't think we'll get back up to those levels we saw a month or so ago during, again, the heavy development of the drought in the northern plains. So you just got to be very patient, look for those pricing opportunities, don't get too greedy, and try and move some of the grain through the system. Try and be a diversified investor, if you will, and make sequential sales as we move through.
Next week, Iowa State Extension economist Chad Hart will join us to look at corn and soybean markets, as well as crop conditions to the east. University of Nebraska-Lincoln researchers are hoping to learn more about crop characteristics using a suspended camera at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center near Meade. The device is a spider cam, a unit similar to what you might see moving above a football field to track the action below. UNL's Rick is capable of carrying 66 pounds and can go forwards and backwards as well as up and down. The group of scientists is using it for plant phenotyping, measuring things like height, growth, stress tolerance, and lodging. They say it's the only system of its kind in the U.S. and one of only 2 in the world. Frank Bai, one of the researchers involved in the project, recently talked with us to explain how the spider cam works.
So, as you can see here, we have the plant field phenotyping system here. So it's very advanced system, and we can do some measurement for the plant breeding research.
Tell me what you're trying to measure overall.
Yes. So for example, we will do a lot of measurement about plant trait. So for example, the canopy height, the canopy temperature, the canopy structure, and also some vegetative index from the image we took.
So what's the advantage of using something like this rather than a drone?
So comparing to the drone, so first the payload issue. We have 30 kilograms for this to mount the sensors, but for the drone, you cannot get 30 kilograms on it. And the second one is the battery life. So we don't have battery issue at all because we have very powerful battery there. It can work more than 6 hours per day, but it's not for drone to do that.
What sensors or cameras do you all have on the spider cam?
So we have several kinds of cameras, and including a LiDAR. So let's start with cameras. First, we have the thermal infrared camera, and then we have the visible and near infrared camera, and then we have the LiDAR and the spectrometer.
Can you give me an idea of what the camera sees when it's up there in the air?
Yes. So for example, now we use all the cameras to shoot the top view of the canopy. If you use the RGB camera and the near infrared camera, first, it can give you some information of the plant growth. Second, it can give you the NDVI image, which NDVI is a kind of vegetative index, which is very important to detect the vigorous of the crop. And if you use a canopy, the thermal infrared camera, it can give you canopy temperature, which is a 2D image. So you can see how hot is the background and how cool is the plant.
How rare is something like this?
I think there are a few kinds of field phenotyping system there. All of us are trying any possibility to detect the important trait of the plant. So I couldn't say this is the only one to use these cameras, but the combination will be unique.
So this is the first year that you've used this system, right? What have you learned from it so far?
So I think firstly, we have a very good communication with the spider can company. So we are trying to fix all the minor issues for the system installed here, because every location is unique. So we may have very strong wind here, so we need to consider it, and we need to watch how stable it is. And for the data aspect, we already took one round of data using all the sensors on board. We are pretty sure we can get very useful information from our sensors. But from now, we are gradually developing this program to make the protocol and the process automatically, and then we will add more measurement in the future.
Funding for the project is currently provided by UNL's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Researchers hope to use and learn from the device for at least the next several years. Many areas of the state received multiple inches of precipitation over the last few weeks. That's helped not only corn and soybeans, but also pastures and ranges. Nebraska Extension's Bruce Anderson says that rainfall has fueled grass growth and may allow you to manage forages differently. While farmers and ranchers might normally think about grazing during the summer and feeding hay in the winter, Bruce says you might be able to maximize production by letting grasses grow.
What will happen, though, if we graze pasture short now during summer and fall? Well, obviously, growth slows down and produces less than if we let it grow without grazing. To let it grow and accumulate without grazing, you probably need to feed hay. But if you feed hay now, won't you have less of it available for winter? Maybe, but you shouldn't need as much hay for winter because all that extra pasture growth that you accumulated while you fed hay can be grazed this fall and winter when you normally feed hay. In fact, if you allow pastures to grow as much as possible from now until it freezes, you may feed less total hay before next spring than if you follow your standard practice of grazing now and saving hay for winter.
Bruce says you might also be able to use this same practice on pastures and ranges that have recently suffered hail damage. The percentage of Nebraska's corn in good to excellent condition held steady over the last week at 63%. The latest progress report from Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service listed 28% dented, 8 points behind the state's 5-year average. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems joined us earlier this week to give a disease update as farmers approach the final stretch of the growing season. We started by asking about the spread of southern rust.
So this year, as you probably remember, we've talked a lot about southern rust, and we were pretty alarmed when it showed up in Nebraska at least a couple of weeks early, according to the calendar. And in the end, the good news is that while we may have a little bit of it in a lot of places, there's not apparently a lot of it anywhere, or not in many places, and so it did not develop to the extent we thought it could, probably held back by the cooler temperatures we've had the last few weeks, and so that worked in our favor.
At this point in the season, would it be too late to treat it either way?
Most fields are probably beyond that, and so any fields that are in the dent stages, it's probably not economical to treat. If we have some late planted fields that are in dough stages, there's a potential there, but honestly, with the cooler forecast ahead, we don't really expect it to blow up like we did earlier.
Have you seen a lot of gray leaf spot?
Well, gray leaf spot in much of the state where we normally see it has started to develop now, and it is marching its way up the plant. And so the extra moisture we've had lately has probably helped to drive that, the extra dew and high humidity. Cooler temperatures will also slow that down a little bit. Of course, some parts of the state are a little warmer than others, probably see a little bit of it there. And so some people have treated for gray leaf spot, but again, the crop stage is going to determine that.
Describe what bacterial leaf streak has been like this season.
Well, this year, in many ways like last year, we saw bacterial leaf streak develop very early, and in fact, we actually confirmed it on plants as young as the 4th leaf stage, very small corn. And so in places it developed early, in others it may have developed a little bit later, but it is flaring up in quite a few areas. It's very hybrid dependent though, and so some fields may be seeing more of it than others, and of course that varies between popcorn and field corn too.
UNL, along with some other universities, has some money, grant funding now to study this. What exactly will we be looking at?
Well, we're very excited about a lot of the research projects that we've initiated and that we're collaborating with some of our neighboring states' researchers on. And so, for example, we have a project looking at the impacts of crop rotation and tillage practices in various parts of the state on this disease. And while we don't expect it to eliminate disease pressure, we're just wondering at the effects of some of the practices we're already using on the disease development, and that is funded and supported by USDA, and we appreciate that support. We're also continuing to work on our survey of the disease, really trying to get a better handle on where it is in the state, and so the Nebraska Corn Board has helped us sponsor that, and at this point we've confirmed it in 56 counties in Nebraska. And so certainly we're probably going to find it eventually in some of those other counties. And so as people start to see it in some of their areas, and if they haven't seen it before, we'd surely like to know about that and get some samples.
The last time we talked to you had been looking at other crops outside of corn that might be a host for this. Do you know any more about that?
And so over the wintertime, we did a lot of work in the greenhouse with bacterial leaf streak, looking to see what other plant species might be vulnerable to it, to help us understand which ones might actually provide a reservoir of the bacteria or another overwintering site. And so one of our graduate students, Tara Hartman, and other members of our lab did that work. And so what they've learned is that it looks like under our testing conditions in the greenhouse, oats look to be susceptible, at least the variety that we worked with. And so if you're working with a cover crop that may have oats in it, we might want to look at that for disease development. Now these are greenhouse data, and so we have moved that out to the field, and by this fall we'll know more about those results. But we're also finding that some of our common weed species and our native prairie grasses did develop disease too. And so some of those might be bristly foxtail, green foxtail, and a surprise, yellow nutsedge, which is not a grass at all. And so that, in addition to big blue stem, little blue stem, orchard grass, Indian grass, and timothy, may all provide a host for this bacterium, but we don't know yet how important that will be in the field for contributing to disease development later in corn.
You can find more resources on corn disease identification under the MJ Extras tab on the Market Journal website. The August Nebraska Farmer features a story on the Brazil Groundwater Management Area, a project covering 756 square miles over 3 counties and 4 natural resources districts. Located in northeast Nebraska, the land has experienced a steady rise in nitrate groundwater levels since the 1980s. This month's magazine says researchers believe the use of nitrogen fertilizer in cropping systems and the fertilization of urban lawns have contributed to the problem. You can read about some of the practices to manage those issues in the August Nebraska Farmer. Nebraska Extension recently wrapped its 2017 soybean management field days after holding events at 4 sites in the state. The location-based trials aim to give growers unbiased research in their growing regions. Nebraska Extension educator Keith Glewen organizes the field days each year. We talked with him in North Platte, a location that held significance this year as the field days had never been that far west in the state.
Well, Jeff, first of all, we've been on the road with this program for 17 years now, and we try to capture the different soybean growing regions in Nebraska. And to be honest with you, this is as far west as we've ever been. And one of the reasons is we know soybeans are moving west, and there's growers out there who are investing in research and market development and so forth. And it's only fair that we try to provide them with some unbiased research-based information.
For people in the East, can you describe how prevalent soybeans are in this area, maybe kind of how they're used right now?
Well, their use, of course, is not much different than what the growers, marketing beans for meal and oil. But growers here are looking at it as a rotational crop because they're having some issues with continuous corn. There's been some disease problems in most recent years that have shown up, and then of course there's some insect resistant issues, and they're finding out that if they rotate beans with corn, that when they rotate back to corn, they get a yield boost from it. And of course their cost of production isn't quite as high as it is for irrigated corn production.
What would be the challenges to growing it in this region?
I think one of the challenges is identifying the right genetic material to plant, in other words, the right varieties. There hasn't probably been a lot of work done in comparison to eastern Nebraska by private industry and by public entities as far as variety testing. There's a lot of unique growing regions when you move across Nebraska, and certainly western Nebraska is no stranger to that. So you have a lot of differences in soils. pH can be a factor here as far as soils are concerned. You have differences in elevation, which can make a big difference in the response of a variety compared to being in the Platte River Valley like we're at right here. So those are probably a couple big challenges. And then if you've never grown soybeans, there's all the issues associated with weed management that you have to become familiar with if you're going to succeed.
Tell me about some of the bigger topics and the more important topics that are being discussed at this year's Soybean Management Field Days.
Well, of course, the big buzz in the soybean world right now is the issue with contamination and drift and volatilization and inversions and so forth with some of our phenoxy herbicides. And we're addressing that here. So I'm sure growers will learn a lot about the issue. Irrigation management here is very important. It costs money to pump water, and we want to conserve our water for the future. And so we have a good complement of faculty members here, Nebraska Extension people that are going to address that, both in their research plots here as well as the presentations they give today to the growers.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. And of course, during this last week, we've seen some substantial rainfall occur across much of the Sandhills, and then, of course, east central, northeast, and southeast Nebraska. Seemed like the precipitation stopped a little bit as we got toward the South Dakota border, but substantial moisture nonetheless. Unofficial reports, 4 to 7 inches is very common over the last 7 days. Combined with the 2-week totals, many of these areas have approached 9 inches, and unofficial reports up to 12 inches. To put that in perspective, 12 inches is about 50% of normal precipitation in the central Sandhills. Now, of course, over the next 7-day period, we're going to be dealing with Hurricane Harvey. But before we get to Harvey and its impacts along the coastal regions of the Gulf of Mexico, we need to look at the current drought monitor depiction. And if we go to the current drought monitor depiction, what we are going to notice is much of the drought areas in Nebraska have been reduced to normal. We're looking at abnormally dry conditions for western Nebraska, but we've seen the reductions in western Iowa. We've seen some reductions in the eastern Dakotas, and the drought has been lifted up toward the South Dakota border. So we are seeing improving conditions, and with the precipitation from Thursday, it was possible that we are also going to see some improvements next week in northeast Nebraska. Today in the upper atmosphere, we have a northwest flow with ridging to our west, a trough trying to develop across the Great Lakes region, and of course Harvey in the upper atmosphere showing it coming on shore. At the surface, low pressure up in North Dakota, northwestern Kansas. The combination of these two is going to create a moisture convergence area across Minnesota, the eastern Dakotas, and possibly into extreme northeastern Nebraska, and of course heavy precipitation along the coast. Tomorrow the trough deepens in the Great Lakes regions, and then we will see low pressure developing in the portions of western Kansas, western portions of Oklahoma. That's going to allow a convergence of moisture over eastern Nebraska with cool high pressure coming in behind it. So we are going to be looking at widespread precipitation. The trough on Monday deepens. Harvey slowly migrates into northeastern portions of Texas. High pressure remains firmly in control on Monday across the region, so we're expecting dry weather here in the Central Plains, but the heavy precipitation will be along the Gulf Coast. Light precipitation to our south, and most of this I think is overdone. On Tuesday, we see that troughing action in the Great Lakes remain. We start to see the ridge building in with warmer conditions into our region, so high pressure firmly controlled. It's going to be pleasant, but a little bit warm. A little bit of light precipitation in the eastern Corn Belt. The heavy moisture starts to move its way into Louisiana. As we get into Wednesday, there are signs that Harvey will start to come on shore and start to open up. Again, heavy precipitation with a surface low, high pressure across a substantial portion of the Corn Belt. Not much in the way of any moisture expected. Here's the remnants of Harvey starting to make its way northward, and we expect some flooding considerations in this region. On Thursday, we start to see it opening up and starting to lift toward the northeast. So here comes Harvey. We're going to see this moisture spread up into the mid-Mississippi River Valley and Tennessee River Valley regions. So we are expecting a continuation of the flooding, just a little bit of monsoon moisture to our west. And as we get into the day on Friday, here comes another push of cold air. So we're going to watch this as we go into the first part of September. Harvey starts to move its way up into the mid-Mississippi and the lower Ohio River Valley, so we expect that flooding area to start spreading toward the eastern Corn Belt, and this will be an item to watch as we go into next weekend for the potential of significant moisture in the eastern Corn Belt. In terms of the temperatures, with Harvey moving there and the cloud cover and the cool air coming in below normal temperatures, widespread for the entire period, warmth to our northwest. In terms of precipitation, heavy precipitation all the way along the eastern seaboard, so we'll probably see some problems coming out of the eastern Corn Belt, dry conditions here for the Central Plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on grain markets, crop phenotyping, corn diseases, and growing soybeans in west central Nebraska. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Chad Hart will be our market analyst, and Tina Barrett will look at the USDA's latest farm income forecast. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.